There's a quiet tragedy that unfolds every single day in offices, homes, classrooms, and relationships. It's not loud, it doesn't make headlines, and no one writes epic poems about it. But it shapes destinies in silence. It's the story of the person who gives and gives and gives until there's almost nothing left. Not because they were defeated by some grand external enemy, but because their kindness was slowly weaponized against them. They were nice, and that niceness became their cage. Have you ever noticed how some people move through life with invisible, "please take advantage of me" signs on their backs? Not because they're weak in the conventional sense. Often they're empathetic, sensitive, eager to be good. Yet over time, they find themselves carrying the emotional labor of entire groups, picking up slack at work, saying yes when their soul screams no, and wondering, quietly, bitterly, why no one seems to do the same for them. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote that the most spiritual human beings, as the strongest, find their happiness where others would find their destruction. What he meant was that true strength is not found in meek compliance, but in the courage to assert one's will, to shape one's life actively rather than merely react to the demands of others. And yet, many good people, perhaps people like you, mistake repression for virtue. They confuse self-sacrifice with moral superiority. And slowly, they erode their own boundaries in the name of being nice. But here's the paradox. Niceness, when it is rooted in fear, is not kindness. It's self-abandonment. And the world, consciously or unconsciously, exploits self-abandonment. Think about this for a moment. How many times have you agreed to something you didn't want to do because you didn't want to upset someone? How often have you swallowed your opinions, dimmed your light, or absorbed someone else's responsibilities because it felt easier than asserting yourself? And how many nights have you lain awake, feeling unseen, unappreciated, perhaps even resentful, but unable to break the cycle? This is not a small issue. It's a psychological pattern that shapes identities, careers, and relationships. If left unexamined, it can become a lifelong script. Always the helper, never the hero of your own story. Throughout this video, we're going to explore something deeper than just learning to say no. We'll dive into Nietzsche's provocative vision of human strength and will, Jung's insights into the shadow self, Stoic reflections on self-respect, and modern psychological research on boundaries, people-pleasing, and self-worth. We'll unravel why so many nice people are unconsciously playing a role that was handed to them early in life, and how they can rewrite that script, not by becoming cruel or selfish, but by becoming whole. By the end, you won't just understand why this happens. You'll see the psychological and philosophical mechanisms that keep this pattern alive, and perhaps more importantly, how to transcend it. Because stopping the cycle of being exploited doesn't mean abandoning your goodness. It means anchoring it in strength. Before we continue, take a moment to imagine this. What would your life look like if your kindness came from power, not fear? If people respected your boundaries not because you begged them to, but because you embodied them? That shift alone can change everything. And if you're someone who's tired of feeling like life is something happening to you, rather than something you're actively shaping, consider joining this journey fully. Subscribe, not just to the channel, but to the idea that your growth is worth committing to. We're going to go deep, and you won't want to miss what comes next. This tendency to be too nice is not new. Philosophers and psychologists have observed it for centuries, often in different language. In ancient Greece, Socrates warned about the unexamined life. He believed that much of human suffering comes from living according to unchallenged assumptions. One of those assumptions, still alive today, is that being good means being agreeable. But Socrates would have asked, whose definition of goodness are you living by? Consider a story. In a small office, there's a woman named Elena. She's competent, diligent, and everyone likes her. She brings coffee for the team, stays late to fix mistakes others made, and volunteers for every task. She never complains. She wants to be seen as helpful, as good. Over the years, she becomes indispensable, but not respected. Her kindness is taken for granted. She's passed over for promotions because she's not assertive. She's the emotional glue of the workplace, but emotionally she's fraying. One day, a younger colleague, less experienced but far more self-assured, gets the role she quietly dreamed of. She congratulates them with a smile. But inside, something breaks. Elena's story is not exceptional. It's everywhere. And beneath it lies a psychological truth. People treat you, in large part, according to the standards you set for yourself. Not the ones you declare verbally, but the ones you live. Elena lived a script of self-erasure. She thought that if she gave enough, eventually others would see her worth. But people rarely reward invisible sacrifices. They respond to clear signals. Nietzsche would have called Elena's approach a form of slave morality. In his framework, slave morality arises when people define goodness not through strength, creativity, or self-assertion, but through meekness, compliance, and the avoidance of offense. It's a morality born from fear, not power. It praises being nice, not because niceness is inherently good, but because it poses no threat. It maintains the social order at the cost of the individual's vitality. Modern psychology echoes this. The people-pleasing pattern often emerges in childhood, especially in environments where love or approval was conditional. A child learns, if I'm good, if I don't upset anyone, if I make myself useful, I'll be safe. Over time, this becomes automatic. The adult becomes the endlessly accommodating friend, partner, employee. The problem is, what once kept them safe now keeps them stuck. Have you ever traced your own niceness back to its roots? What if that urge to keep everyone happy isn't pure altruism, but a defense mechanism you no longer need? Jung spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject or repress because they don't fit the image we want to present. For many nice people, the shadow contains their assertiveness, their anger, their capacity for healthy selfishness. They've locked these parts away, fearing they'd make them unlovable. But in doing so, they become incomplete. And incomplete people are easy to exploit, not because they lack value, but because they're not standing in their full power. This brings us to a subtle but critical distinction. Niceness is often about being liked. Kindness is about being real. Niceness bends to avoid offense. Kindness sometimes offends because it tells the truth. Niceness seeks external validation. Kindness stems from internal clarity. And if you've spent years conflating the two, the first step is simply seeing the pattern for what it is. Imagine standing in front of a mirror and asking, who would I be if I wasn't afraid of being disliked? What truths would I speak? What boundaries would I hold? What parts of me have I buried to maintain the image of being good? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the kind of questions Nietzsche lived for. He believed that growth comes not from comfort but from confrontation, with ourselves, with our fears, with the world as it truly is. And so, if you're still with me, stay tuned, because in the next part we're going to peel back the layers even further. We'll explore the deeper philosophical forces at play, and how reclaiming your power isn't about abandoning your humanity. It's about finally stepping into it. When Nietzsche spoke of the Übermensch, the Overman, he wasn't describing a tyrant or a heartless egoist. He was describing a human being who has transcended inherited moralities, who no longer lives by the rules others have unconsciously written for them. Most people, he believed, are like actors reciting lines written by someone else: religion, society, family, culture. But the Übermensch writes their own script. They don't follow niceness as a rule. They embody authenticity as a way of being. That's the crucial difference. Now imagine this through the lens of the nice person. They are living out a script, but it isn't one they authored. Maybe it was written when they were 6 years old, watching a parent's anger and deciding, if I'm perfect, if I keep the peace, everything will be okay. Maybe it was written when they were teenagers, craving social belonging, learning that approval comes from compliance. Over time, these lines get rehearsed so many times that they feel like identity. I'm just a nice person. But what if that's not who you are? It's just who you learn to be to survive. Jung would call this the persona, the mask you wear to interact with the world. It's not inherently bad. Everyone has a persona. It's how society functions. But problems arise when the mask becomes fused with the self. When you forget that you are more than the role you've been playing. For the overly nice person, The persona is one of endless agreeableness, self-effacement, and emotional availability. It looks beautiful from the outside, but beneath that mask often there's exhaustion, suppressed resentment, or a quiet hunger to be seen differently. Cognitive psychology offers us a powerful insight here. People-pleasing is maintained through reinforcement loops. Each time you say yes when you want to say no, you avoid short-term discomfort, the possibility of conflict, disapproval, or rejection. Your brain rewards you with relief. That relief becomes addictive. Over time, your neural pathways become wired to choose immediate harmony over long-term authenticity. This is why many people know intellectually that they should set boundaries but still freeze in the moment. Their brains have rehearsed a single script for decades: keep the peace at all costs. Have you ever caught yourself agreeing to something before you even consciously processed the request? As if your mouth said yes, while some deeper part of you was silently screaming no. That automatic response isn't evidence of weakness, it's evidence of conditioning. But conditioning can be examined. It can be rewritten. Let's turn to an ancient story. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that true freedom comes not from controlling the world, but from mastering our internal responses. There's a parable told of a man who spent his life trying to please everyone in his village. One day, exhausted, he asked an old philosopher how to make everyone finally happy with him. The philosopher smiled gently and said, "Die." The man was shocked. The philosopher continued, "As long as you live, someone will disapprove. If your goal is universal approval, your life will be slavery. But if your goal is integrity, disapproval loses its power over you." This cuts to the heart of the issue. The nice person is enslaved not by others, but by their own fear of disapproval. That fear dictates their choices more than their authentic desires. Nietzsche would say that they have not yet created their own values. They are still living under the values imposed by the herd. And in Nietzsche's eyes, the herd morality is designed to suppress the exceptional, the assertive, the boundary-setting individual, because such individuals threaten the comfortable order. Modern neuroscience confirms that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. That's why it can feel unbearable to say no, to assert yourself, to risk being seen as difficult. But here's the critical insight: discomfort is not danger. Your brain learned early on that disapproval equals threat, but that's no longer true. As an adult, disapproval often just means you're asserting yourself in ways that some people don't like. And that's okay. Think of someone in your life who seems to command natural respect. They may not be loud or aggressive. Often they're calm, grounded, clear. They know their boundaries. They say no without apology. They don't over-explain. They don't seek to be universally liked, but they are deeply respected by those who matter. These people are not necessarily born that way. They've simply stopped negotiating their worth through constant accommodation. Nietzsche might say they've begun to create their own values. Jung would say they've integrated their shadow. They've reclaimed the parts of themselves that say, "I have a right to exist as I am, not just as what others want me to be." Modern psychology would say they've interrupted the people-pleasing reinforcement loop and built new habits through conscious practice. This isn't merely theoretical. Let's look at a modern example. David was known in his friend group as the dependable one. He was the guy who helped everyone move, who lent money without expecting it back, who always listened but rarely spoke about himself. Over time, though, he began to notice something painful. When he needed help, silence. When he finally asserted a small boundary, saying he couldn't help someone move one weekend, they responded with guilt-tripping. "But you always help." That's when he realized people had come to expect his self-erasure as the price of his belonging. David went through what many go through, a boundary-setting crisis. The first few times he said no, he felt waves of guilt, anxiety, and fear of losing relationships. But something remarkable happened. A few people reacted badly. They were invested in the old dynamic. But others adapted, and some new people, drawn to his newfound self-respect, entered his life. Over time, his relationships shifted from being transactional to mutual. He wasn't less kind. He was just no longer afraid of not being liked by everyone. Why is this so transformative? Because once you stop being addicted to universal approval, you stop being so easily manipulated. Nietzsche wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe." That struggle doesn't mean becoming cold or detached. It means learning to live from an inner compass rather than external applause. Jung would say this is the process of individuation, becoming whole. It involves integrating the assertive, boundary-setting parts of yourself you've disowned. It means allowing yourself to be seen in your fullness, not just your niceness. It means realizing that some people will not like the real you. And that's not only acceptable, it's necessary. If everyone likes your persona, it usually means your true self hasn't fully shown up yet. Here's a question worth lingering on. When was the last time you disappointed someone for the sake of your own integrity? How did it feel? Did the world end, or did something deeper in you grow stronger? As you think about that, let this idea settle in. Kindness without boundaries is not kindness, it's martyrdom. And martyrdom, in the psychological sense, often breeds quiet resentment. You've probably felt it, that low-grade bitterness that accumulates when you give without reciprocity, when you're there for everyone else, but no one seems to notice your fatigue. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. But if left unaddressed, that resentment can eventually erupt or calcify into cynicism. The antidote is not to swing to the opposite extreme and become selfish or callous. It's to root your kindness in strength rather than fear. To become, in Nietzschean terms, a creator of your own values, and in Jungian terms, an integrated self. This doesn't mean rejecting your compassionate nature. It means claiming the power that makes that compassion sustainable. If you've been resonating with this, chances are you're already sensing that something in your old script no longer fits. Maybe you've been nodding along, recognizing these patterns in your relationships, your work, your family dynamics. Maybe you've tried to change before but felt pulled back into the old role. That's normal. Scripts don't rewrite themselves overnight. But awareness is the first crack through which the light enters. And if you're finding this exploration meaningful, make sure you stay with me all the way. This isn't just intellectual, it's transformative when absorbed deeply. You might even want to subscribe here, not as a passive click, but as a symbolic commitment to stop living by borrowed scripts and start authoring your own. This journey has layers, and we're about to enter the heart of it. Because what happens when the nice person begins to awaken isn't just personal. It reverberates through every relationship they have. And that's where we're headed next. The moment a nice person begins to shift is almost always quiet at first. It rarely looks like a dramatic declaration. Instead, it begins with a small internal tremor. A thought that used to be instantly dismissed now lingers a little longer. Why am I always the one saying yes? Why am I exhausted but unable to rest? Why do I feel invisible in relationships I pour so much into? That tremor is the first crack in the old persona, the signal that something buried is beginning to stir. Nietzsche called this kind of inner movement the stirring of the will to power. Not power in the crude sense of domination, but power as life affirmation, the instinct to shape one's existence rather than be shaped by it. For the nice person, this often feels like guilt at first. That's the trick. When you begin to assert yourself after years of self-erasure, guilt masquerades as morality. It whispers, "You're being selfish." But this is not the voice of truth. It's the echo of the old conditioning. Nietzsche would urge you to examine it ruthlessly. Whose voice is it, really? Who benefits from you feeling guilty every time you choose yourself? Jung would frame this as the beginning of shadow integration. The shadow, remember, contains all the parts of ourselves we've rejected. For nice people, that shadow often holds their assertiveness, their anger, their desires. When these parts start to surface, they can feel alien, even dangerous. But they're not evil, they're simply unlived. Jung famously said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This means that to become whole, you must stop pretending that the parts of you that say no, that have edges and boundaries, are inherently bad. They're part of your wholeness. Psychologically, this stage often involves cognitive dissonance. Your old identity, I'm the nice one, the helper, the dependable friend, is being challenged by new behaviors. This creates inner tension, like stretching muscles that have atrophied from disuse. For example, the first time you set a firm boundary with someone who's used to your compliance, they might react with surprise or even anger. You'll feel the pull to retreat, to smooth things over. This is the critical moment. Modern behavioral science shows that habits don't change by insight alone. They change through consistent, repeated action in the face of emotional discomfort. Consider the story of Maya. For years, she was the emotional caretaker of her friend group. She hosted gatherings, remembered everyone's birthdays, listened to every crisis. She loved being there for people, but she began to notice that when she needed support, the room fell silent. One day, exhausted, she decided to test something small. She told a friend she couldn't host the next gathering because she needed a weekend to herself. The friend replied, half joking, "Wow, who are you and what have you done with Maya?" Her instinct was to laugh, to cave, to say just kidding. But she didn't. She held the line. And something shifted, not just externally but inside her. A sense of quiet strength she hadn't felt in years. This is how transformation often begins, not with grand speeches, but with one small no held firmly. One moment of not explaining yourself to death. One time choosing rest over reputation. Each act of self-respect builds an internal scaffolding of power. Nietzsche would call this self-overcoming, the process by which an individual transcends their own limitations and inherited moralities. It's not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more deeply yourself. He wrote, "Become who you are." For the nice person, this means peeling away the layers of learned compliance to reveal the vibrant, complex human beneath. Modern neuroscience supports this. New neural pathways form through repetition and reinforcement. The more you act from a place of authentic self-respect, the more your brain rewires itself to make that the default. At first, it feels unnatural because it is new. But over time, it becomes embodied. Here's something crucial to understand. When you change, your relationships will change. Not everyone will applaud your transformation. Some will feel threatened because your niceness maintained a comfortable dynamic for them. This doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It often means you're doing something necessary. People who genuinely care will adapt. Those who only valued you for your compliance may fall away. This is painful, but it's also clarifying. Nietzsche spoke of the courage required to stand alone at times, to endure temporary solitude as you become more fully yourself. He saw solitude not as isolation, but as the crucible where true individuality is forged. Jung mirrored this sentiment with his idea of individuation. The process of becoming whole often involves detaching from collective expectations, at least for a time. It can feel like betrayal, but in truth, it's fidelity to your deeper self. And modern psychology calls this boundary renegotiation. When you change the rules of engagement in a relationship, the other person has three choices: adapt, resist, or leave. All three responses tell you something valuable. Take the example of Daniel. He grew up in a household where harmony was prized above all else. As an adult, he avoided conflict like the plague. In his romantic relationships, this meant he swallowed his needs, avoided difficult conversations, and overgave in hopes of avoiding abandonment. But when he began therapy, he started to voice small preferences. "Actually, I'd prefer we do it this way. I'm not comfortable with that." His partner initially reacted with confusion. She was used to the old Daniel. But over time, she adjusted, and their relationship became more honest and alive. A previous partner, years earlier, had left him the moment he stopped being endlessly accommodating. At the time, he saw it as proof that being himself was dangerous. Now he sees it as proof that that relationship was built on the sand of his silence. This illustrates a deeper truth. When you stop being the nice person everyone exploits, you may lose some people. But what you lose in shallow approval, you gain in self-respect and authentic connection. The relationships that remain, and the new ones that form, are richer, more reciprocal, more real. And here's where Nietzsche's challenge comes into full view. He didn't believe in half measures. To him, the task of becoming fully human was to take radical responsibility for your life. No more blaming society, family, or circumstance. The question was always, will you live by inherited values, or will you create your own? For the nice person, this means asking, will I continue to live by the script of endless compliance, or will I author a new way of being? Jung would add, will you integrate the parts of yourself you've exiled, or remain fragmented? Modern psychology would phrase it, will you tolerate the discomfort required to build new habits, or retreat to the comfort of old patterns? These are not easy questions, but they are the questions that separate a life of quiet resentment from a life of self-respecting authenticity. You might wonder, does this mean I have to become confrontational, cold, or uncaring to stop being exploited? Absolutely not. In fact, the opposite is true. When you act from fear, fear of disapproval, fear of rejection, you distort your kindness into a form of currency, a way to buy safety. But when you act from strength, your kindness becomes a gift, not a transaction. People feel the difference. One is manipulative in a subtle, unconscious way. The other is genuine. Have you noticed that some people's kindness feels empowering to be around, while others' kindness feels draining? The difference often lies in whether it's rooted in wholeness or in fear. This is why integrating your shadow, embracing Nietzsche's challenge of self-overcoming, and rewiring your psychological patterns isn't selfish work. It's the most generous thing you can do. Because when your kindness is rooted in strength, it nourishes both you and others. If you're still here listening, reflecting, then something in you is already stirring. Maybe it's a part of you that's been waiting for permission to stop performing and start living. Maybe it's the faint but undeniable sense that your life can be authored differently. If so, stay with me, because this awakening isn't the end. It's the beginning of something extraordinary. And if you haven't yet, subscribing here isn't just about following a channel. It's about joining a conversation that asks more of you than passive consumption. It's about committing to the lifelong art of becoming who you truly are. That's not a small journey. It's the most important one there is. In the final part, we'll bring everything together. We'll look at what life begins to feel like once you've crossed the threshold, when niceness gives way to authentic strength, and relationships, work, and self-concept reorganize around your newfound clarity. And we'll leave you with a question that might echo for days after. When a person stops being the nice person everyone exploits, life doesn't suddenly become perfect. It becomes real. At first, this reality can feel unsettling. The old certainties fall away. Some relationships change shape. Some disappear altogether. There's often a quiet mourning for the familiar, even if the familiar was suffocating. But slowly, a new kind of peace begins to settle in. Not the fragile peace of pleasing everyone, but the solid peace of living in alignment with yourself. Nietzsche once wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." The why of the nice person used to be external. I must keep others happy. But as you shift, that why turns inward. I must live in accordance with my deeper self. This new why doesn't crumble under disapproval. It doesn't shatter when someone calls you selfish for having boundaries. It stands firm because it's rooted in something deeper than the fragile applause of others. It's rooted in your will to shape your own life. Jung would say that at this stage, the shadow is no longer an enemy. It's an ally. Your assertiveness, once feared, now walks beside your compassion. Your anger, once suppressed, now fuels your sense of justice. Your no becomes as honest as your yes. You no longer fracture yourself to fit into other people's expectations. And modern psychology would add, your brain, once wired for automatic compliance, begins to default to self-respect. What once felt unnatural now feels necessary. The effects ripple outward. In relationships, honesty replaces unspoken resentment. People may not always like what you say, but they can trust that it's real. At work, you stop drowning in responsibilities that were never yours to begin with, and you find that your contributions carry more weight because they're chosen, not coerced. In your inner world, the quiet bitterness that used to simmer begins to dissolve, replaced by a steady sense of dignity. Imagine for a moment walking into a room and not scanning for what everyone else needs first, but checking in with yourself. Imagine speaking a boundary without rehearsing it for days. Imagine giving help because you choose to, not because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't. Imagine being liked or disliked not for your performance, but for your presence. That is what freedom begins to feel like. Nietzsche would call this the life of the creator. No longer merely reacting to the world, you are shaping it through the values you've consciously chosen. You've stopped living according to herd morality and started living as an author of your own story. He believed that most people never take this leap. They spend their lives as camels, burdened with other people's expectations. A few become lions, rebelling against the old scripts. But the rarest become children again, not naive, but free creators playing with life on their own terms. For the nice person who awakens, this is the path, from camel to lion to child. From burdened compliance to courageous self-assertion to joyful authenticity. Jung might describe this as individuation reaching a new stage. The persona and the shadow are no longer at war. They've become parts of a larger, integrated whole. Your niceness hasn't disappeared, it's transformed. It's no longer a mask, it's an expression of genuine character. And psychology would note that this is the point where new habits are no longer effortful, they're embodied. Saying no isn't an act of rebellion anymore, it's just who you are. This transformation also reveals something about the world. Not everyone wants you to wake up. Some prefer the old version of you because it served them. But others, often the ones who truly care, will welcome your wholeness. They'll adjust to the new rhythms of your self-respect, and the connections that remain will be deeper for it. When you live authentically, you give others permission to do the same. That's the quiet revolution. It doesn't shout, but it echoes. And here's the profound twist. When you stop being the endlessly nice person, your capacity for real kindness actually grows. Because it's no longer entangled with fear, it becomes cleaner, stronger, freer. You stop giving out of compulsion and start giving out of choice. You stop resenting your generosity because it no longer costs you your selfhood. Nietzsche's vision of the strong spirit, Jung's vision of integration, modern psychology's vision of healthy boundaries, they all converge here, in the life of someone who has stopped performing and started existing fully. As we close, I want you to ask yourself one question, not as a rhetorical exercise, but as a seed that might grow in the days ahead. If I stopped needing to be liked by everyone, who would I become? Sit with that, not for a minute, but for a while, because somewhere in that answer lies a version of you that has been waiting patiently for years. A version not defined by fear, but by power. Not by compliance, but by choice. And if you felt something stir as you've listened to this, don't let it fade into the background noise of daily life. Stay engaged with this journey, through reflection, through conversation, through spaces like this one. Subscribing here isn't about chasing algorithms. It's about keeping this dialogue alive in your life. It's a way of saying to yourself, I'm committed to becoming more than the script I was handed. This isn't the end of the story. It's the moment you pick up the pen,